I'm, del I'm delighted to see so many people with great interest in this topic. My name is Patrik Johansson. I'm a member of the Harvard Club of Seattle board. And to start this in the right way, I just want to recognize that currently I am sitting in the coastal Salish people space, including the Duwamish people. And for the purposes of this symposium, we will be in Massachusetts, in the space of the Massachusetts people, where Harvard University is located. Also neighboring communities, the Nipmuc and Wampanoag people. And I also want to start out by acknowledging that the land on which Harvard University stands for millennia, before the brick buildings went up, it's always been a place of knowledge, learning, and instruction. And hopefully, the learning that comes out of this session can help our alma mater, Harvard University, move forward in a way that recognizes the priorities of the indigenous communities it's by its own governance structure is intended to serve. And with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker for our Examining the Origins and Legacy of Indigenous Slavery on the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower's landing. Our first speaker is Margaret Newell. She's a graduate of Brown University and the University of Virginia, not Harvard, sadly, as she points out, but she is a professor of history at Ohio State University. Her teaching and writing span many topics, including the history of capitalism, Native American history, slavery studies, and comparative revolutions. Professor Newell's most recent book, Brethren by Nature, New England Indians, Colonists, and the Origins of American Slavery, won the 2016 James A. Rawley Prize from the Organization of American Historians for the best book on race relations in the US, and the Peter Gomes Prize from the Massachusetts Historical Society. Ohio State recognized her as a distinguished scholar, its highest honor in 2019. Just for fun, she leads study abroad trips to Argentina and curates the occasional art show in Columbus. And I would ask Professor Newell to take it away.
Well, first let me thank the organizers, Patrik, Michael, and Emily from the Harvard Club of Seattle for putting together this amazing panel discussion and for bringing so many people to it. And thank all of you for giving up a part of your Saturday afternoon to discuss these important subjects. And I must say I'm thrilled to be joining this virtual stage with such wonderful co-presenters. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what they have to say and what all of you have to say in the Q&A section of today's talks. So Patrik gave me a charge and some topics to talk about. And first he asked me to talk about the origins of indigenous slavery in New England. So I locate, so certainly there had been, enslavement had been part of the earliest English interactions with indigenous populations in coastal North America. So most of the voyages of exploration engaged in kidnapping of indigenous people to bring back as proof, to bring back as future interpreters and guides to successive voyages of plantation and colonization, and occasionally to sell at the slave markets of Europe. And this happened to indigenous people from Cape Cod, from Martha's Vineyard, and from the areas that are now, Maine and Nova Scotia. But the English colonists most associated with enslavement and long-term enslavement, large numbers, were the groups that established Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. So that's the focus of most of my research. So the large-scale enslavement of indigenous people by these colonial operations really began in earnest with the Pequot War of 1637-38. And here I started seeing that many of these wars pitting colonists against indigenous people in the 17th and 18th century were really about slavery. They might have had kind of complex origin stories and purposes, but once they began, they often became about taking captives and enslaving Native Americans. So whatever the goals, initially enslavement often overtook all other goals. So the Pequot War, we see this very clearly as the as observers, and even some Native American allies of the English commented on the fact that the English really focused on the taking of captives and often attacked not armed Pequots, but places of refuge where women and children and the elderly had gone to escape warfare. So they went after refugees, soft targets, etc., in order to take captives. And we can count about 319 specific people who were captured and enslaved in this war, in addition to many hundreds and thousands killed in the war. And 319 may not seem like many, but it's very difficult to count Indigenous slaves in this period. And actually, this number represented about a third of the available unfree labor force, including white indentured servants, in New England at the end of this war. So I mean, this is a significant number, and these people are engaging in enslavement because they want the labor. They want labor, and they'll take Indigenous labor. Indigenous people were more accessible, and that's why they're being enslaved by the English. So this is labor exploitation, and it's associated with dispossession of people from their lands. So the two things go hand in hand all through the colonial period. Dispossession makes people vulnerable to enslavement. Enslavement is a way to dispossess people. So we have a cycle and a circle. So some of the captives from the Pequot War, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, formally engages a ship, builds a slave pen, and sent 17 men and boys who were traded for African slaves in Providence Island, which was also a Puritan colony off the coast of South America. And these slaves were brought back and distributed, sold. So this was a state action. And I'd say this is another characteristic of Indian slavery in New England, that the state, and by this meaning the local colonial governments, was very involved in the process. Itself often auctioning off captives, as it did in King Philip's War, distributing captives, and creating institutions and laws to spell out the rights of enslavers to recover their enslaved property, fugitive slave laws, and using police power at its disposal to support the enslavement of Indigenous people. And in fact, already after the Pequot War, this language seeped into all of the, into colonial law in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and elsewhere, that what I call it sort of black codes before slavery, and this language of enslavement as a way of mediating relationships between English colonists and indigenous people, saying that Connecticut colonists had the right to just grab people and enslave them if they were trespassing on a Connecticut landholder's land, or so on and so forth. And this language of enslavement just becomes a form of intimidation, oppression, and efforts to subjugate free Indigenous populations in this region. In King Philip's War, which was since 1675 to 1677, the English colonists enslaved between 35% and 40% of the surviving population of southern New England. So this is a giant episode of enslavement. It's mass enslavement. And again, taking captives formed an important part of the origins and purpose of this war for the English. And there's also lots of taking of, basically kidnapping of people who weren't associated with the war. Christianized Indians who were interned during the war, the islands in Boston Harbor where these people were interned, who were actually allies of the English, whose husbands and sons and brothers were being forced to fight with the English. I mean, people would raid these internment camps and steal women, children, and sell them to the Azores Islands and elsewhere. So there's like these wars also become giant events for create flows of refugees, and people prey on these refugee flows outside of the theaters of war. Massachusetts even commissioned a regiment that were privateers. That was literally their contract. Privateers are sea pirates. These people were like land pirates, and they just basically ran around slaving and bringing people back in for the colony to auction off. So again, as with the Pequot captives, some of the captives from King Philip's War ended up being exported in a diaspora. So some ended up in the Azores Islands, some ended up in the Caribbean, Jamaica, and elsewhere. Others were sold at the slave markets of Cadiz in Spain, and some even ended up rowing English galleys. They were galley slaves in the Mediterranean in what was then the English colony of Tangier. So, it's like, a painful, horrible diaspora, people sent into, brutal conditions and brutal work and separated from their kin and families. But I'm also interested in the fact that most enslaved Indians in New England, including in the Pequot War and in King Philip's War, were actually kept to work in New England households. So we have to change our picture of early New England to accommodate the fact that there's all these people keeping indigenous slaves, and they're living in the homes of these English colonists, in the attics, in unheated spaces, sleeping on the floors, sharing rooms. The homes and households themselves, which were centers of production, they made things that the family needed and consumed, and made things that households sold to buy the things that they wanted to consume. So this is where everything got made in early America, right? Is in the household. So household labor is where most of these people are being deployed, even though some also ended up working in fishing and whaling. And they worked as mariners. They worked as soldiers. So about 20% of the colonial armies were actually composed of Native Americans that they were sending against, the French and other indigenous groups in the Northeast and so on. They are working, providing childcare, doing the 1,001 tasks it took to make a colonial household run, washing, food preparation, agricultural work, etc. Indian women were working in copper mines and ironworks, so were men, sometimes enslaved, sometimes free labor. So the Indians are forming an important part of the colonial labor force and doing all sorts of essential work. So we can talk a little bit more about this, these sorts of experiences that people had and the kinds of work they did during the Q&A if you'd like to hear a little bit more. In the 18th century, now that warfare in southern New England essentially ended with King Philip's War and the assertion of English colonial control of what had been these territories of the Narragansett, Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and others, the colonists still found opportunities to enslave Indians in the absence of warfare, and this was through what I call judicial enslavement. So they used courts to sentence Indians to involuntary servitude for debt and for petty crimes or non-capital crimes. And in some counties, like Martha's Vineyard and Bristol and Plymouth, as many as 2/3 of the Indians that came before these courts were sentenced to some sort of involuntary servitude. And the other thing that's happening in this period is the constant conversion of free people and indentured servants, or people who might have started out as servants with a kind of contract that limited the amount of time they had to work, converting these people into slaves illegally. This is kind of a hard concept to imagine, but there's this sort of constant process in which people assert ownership over others. And it's very difficult for the people who are victims of this kind of conversion into slavery to do much about it. So this becomes a major form of enslavement in the 18th century. So Patrik had also asked me to talk about Titus, and I wanted to at least end it briefly by talking about who Titus might have been and where he might have come from. By the 1720s, when he's working in the Danforth household, there would be indigenous slaves in many other households in Boston. So up the street, where Samuel Sewell was courting the widow of Wade Still Winthrop, she had an enslaved woman named Juno who basically took Samuel Sewell home at night with a lantern and lit his way home, and served Mrs. Winthrop as a personal servant, had to wait up till all hours of the night to dress her and undress her and take care of the 1,001 tasks in her household. Titus was biracial, it seems, and so he might have been the product of a relationship between an indigenous captive in King Philip's War and a member of the growing African population as enslaved Africans became a larger and larger part of the labor force in the 18th century. Titus also might have been from the southeastern United States, because between 1707 and 1725, New England started importing indigenous slaves from other regions. So-called Spanish Indians that English had raided from Spanish missions in the Southeast, and so-called Carolina Indians that were products of massive enslavement efforts by the English in the Southeast in this period, found their way to New England and were part of that population of enslaved people. Those are some possible origin stories for Titus and possible backgrounds for Titus. So Patrik asked us to kind of keep to a time limit, and I'm pretty much there. I wanted to show you some images really quickly of some of the things that I've been talking about. If we can make a share screen work. So this is the first law of slavery in English America, and it was produced in Massachusetts, not Virginia, not Barbados, or the other places we associate with slavery. And I argue that New England created this law of slavery to try to figure out the status of to establish the status of Pequot captives as enslaved persons. So Massachusetts has the honor of creating the first slave law in colonial America. This is one of the few 17th century portraits of an indigenous person from New England that we have, and it depicts another Pequot captive who ended up in the household of Governor John Winthrop. His name was Cassasinnamon, and he ended up founding the Mashantucket Pequot community that still is around today. This is an auction form, a list of enslaved people auctioned by the colony of Massachusetts during King Philip's War. And you can see this is a quote from one of the military leaders. So, I mean, these military people were just sort of taking captives and buying and selling them along the way. So again, just even trying to count and figure out, get our hands around the scope of enslavement is very difficult. You see these are family groups. There's women and children in these groups of people being auctioned off, babies. This is a map of Tangier. This is where these New England Indian captives were rowing these galleys, and they built this breakwater that surrounded the stonework that surrounded the port in Tangier. Here's another slaveholder, Samuel Shrimpton, who bought enslaved New England Indians at auction, sent some of them to Jamaica, as he says, but deployed some of them on the islands in Boston Harbor, where many people owned plantations. And here's an example of some of the activities of these Spanish Indians I was talking about. And this tells you both some of the work they might have done, if you look at the professions of some of these slaveholders from whom these folks ran away, but this also shows you some of the forms of resistance that indigenous people engaged in. So this is almost an uprising. I mean, I might call this an uprising because it's a mass escape by enslaved people in Boston. And most of these people running away in this group were Carolina and Spanish Indians. And some of these people actually managed to get home. They stole ships and sailed back to St. Augustine, Florida, did things like that. But you can see there's a lot of first families of New England mentioned here. Sam Adams had a Spanish Indian slave. That's why I think, it's possible that's the case for Danforth, but I don't know. And this is a great document, and it's a freedom suit, and a successful one, that was brought by a man named Caesar in New London in the late 1730s. And he was biracial, like Titus, and he made a claim for freedom based on the illegal enslavement of his mother in King Philip's War. She was not supposed to be held as a lifelong slave. Her owner had tried to turn her into a lifelong slave illegally, and she was held as a slave all of her life. But her son protested that and actually won his freedom, and then even sued for reparations. And got them. So we can talk about reparations as a potential endpoint or solution. So I think I'll stop here and let Taluk Whedon have his word. But thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Margaret. And we'll take questions at the end. And next, I would like to introduce Mr. Everett G. Whedon, Jr., Tall Oak, Mashantucket Pequot and Wampanoag educational consultant. Tall Oak was born on September 4th in 1936 in Providence, Rhode Island. He studied at the Rhode Island School of Design from 1955 to 1956. His principal occupation is to be an educational consultant. His affiliations are the Boston Children's Museum, the Haffenreffer Museum of Anthropology at Brown University. In addition, he's a veteran. His military service includes the U.S. Army Reserves from 1957 to 1963. His organizational memberships include the Charlestown Historical Society, where he's been a charter member since 1970. He's also a member of the Connecticut Society of Genealogists, the Rhode Island Historical Society, the Mashantucket Pequot Museum Research Center, and the American and Indian Friends Coalition. He helped develop the concept of the National Day of Mourning observance at Plymouth Rock on Thanksgiving Day 1970. And he is always seeking to generate a more accurate and honest image of our people. And that has led to his participation in several videos, including Kevin Costner's 500 Nations production in 1994 and Mystic Voices, a documentary video on the people. Please welcome Mr. Tall Oak Whedon. Are you ready? I think we need to get you off mute. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to speak about connecting the dots from the Mayflower to the Seaflower. In the limited time I have today, hopefully I can succeed in connecting those dots for you that can bring you to the level of understanding that is mandatory to us working together to begin the changes in attitudes and the self-destructive value system that has put profits before people, as the transplanted fibers of greed and racism have become the primary fibers woven into the fabric of America at its very foundation. Both Titus and my Indian slave ancestor, Toby Whedon, were contemporaries, sharing the same legacy. God forgive America. In 1603, the English began abducting Indians from New England to Virginia coastal waters to carry to England. By 1610, taking captives Indians to England had become routine. In 1614, 27 Wampanoag Indians were captured from Massachusetts to be sold as slaves, including Squanto, who met the Pilgrims. 1616, Indian slave would prove the best laborers for this country, quote unquote, was stated by an early Bermuda settler. 1619, Dutch slave traders, after selling the first 20 black slaves to Jamestown, Virginia, continued on to Bermuda, where 29 more were sold. 1620, the Pilgrims land in Wampanoag country, where they are met in friendship by the Sachem Massasoit. By 1628, 200 Puritans arrive in Salem, Massachusetts to form Massachusetts Bay Company as they became aware of the wampum trade controlled by the Pequots. By 1630, nearly 1,000 more settlers arrived, beginning the Great Migration, including Governor John Winthrop Sr. 1631, Indian servitude begins in Massachusetts Bay Colony to maximize the profits. England had already begun dabbling in the African slave trade. By 1633, another epidemic or plague kills large numbers of Indians in the Bay Area, causing one clergyman to hypocritically describe the event as, quote, the Lord clearing their title to this place, unquote. 2 years, in 1634, 2 years after Puritans began trade and settlement in Pequot territory, they find a suitable excuse to declare war on them shortly after making wampum legal tender in the colony. The millions of these beads extorted continuously to provide the treasury for the Bay Colony were very likely helped. They were very likely helped to establish the early funding for Harvard, which was authorized by the General Court on November 15, 1637. In 1636, Rhode Island colony settled in Narragansett territory. The first slave ship in America, the Desire, was built in Marblehead, Massachusetts, only 6 years after the Great Migration. 1637, the same year wampum was made legal tender, 400 old men, women, and children were burned alive in Mystic, Connecticut at the Mystic Fort by the English army. Richard Church, the father of Benjamin, was in that army. 2 months later, 17 Pequots who survived were loaded into coffin-sized compartments with New England rum and dry fish on the Desire's maiden voyage. In 1638, the Pequot not slaughtered were forced to sign the Treaty of Hartford, dissolving the tribe, while hundreds were sold out of their own country to help pay the cost of the war. That same year, sugar begins to be a cash crop in Barbados, requiring more slave labor. By 1639, the Great Migration begins to overflow into the conquered Pequot lands from Massachusetts Bay Colony as a slave boy appears in the Hartford records. That same year, the colony of New Haven is established. That same year, Captain Benjamin Church was born in Plymouth, Massachusetts. By 1640, New England merchants entered the slave trade. By 1641, Massachusetts Bay Colony becomes the first English colony to recognize slavery as a, quote, legal institution, unquote. 1642, Harvard's first commencement with 19-year-old George Downing, the son of Emmanuel, in the graduating class. By 1643, Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, and Connecticut organized as the United Colonies Against Indians, and at their very first business meeting, authorized the murder of the powerful Narragansett sachem Mayantinomi, who made the mistake of helping them in the Pequot War. By 1644, after ordering murder of Mayantinomi, the United Colonies declare war on the Narragansett. 1647, Canonicus died. 1649, John Winthrop Sr. died. 1650, wampum has its highest value in the colonies. By 1661, wampum no longer was legal tender in Massachusetts. In 1660, Massasoit dies in the winter, succeeded by his son, Wamsutta. Wamsutta dies mysteriously and is succeeded as sachem by his brother, King Philip. The Company of Royal Adventurers trading to Africa was chartered to manage the slave trade. By 1672, the Royal African Company, chartered by Charles II, to carry on a growing African slave trade for a quarter of a century, overlapping King Philip's War. By 1675, January of that year, the body of John Sassaman, the treacherous praying Indian spy of the English who attended Harvard Indian College and helped burn Pequot Indian women and children alive 38 years before, was found beneath the ice of Assawampset Pond, which ignited King Philip's War. By that same year, 1675, on November the 2nd, the United Colonies declare war on the Narragansetts. December the 19th, 6 days before Christmas, once again, over 300 old men, women, and children were burned alive during the season of goodwill towards men in the Great Swamp Massacre at the Narragansett Fort, 10 minutes up the road from where I now live. August the 2nd, King Philip's wife and only son were captured to be sold. August the 12th, King Philip was killed by a Wampanoag Indian trader at the Mount Hope lands that he lived and died for. His body was cut in quarters and his head was cut off and put on a pole for 25 years in front of the very same church where these pious pilgrims did all this praying to terrorize all Indians into submission. August the 14th, a meeting was called in Providence to decide just how long the many Indian prisoners taken there would be held in slavery for fighting for their freedom. August the 17th, Philip's head was brought triumphantly into Plymouth, where it was placed on a pole for 25 years, excuse me, in front of the first church to terrorize Indians into submission. 1677, at the end of the war, Indian killers were rewarded with confiscated Indian land and Indian prisoners to sell into slavery. By 1680, the Mount Hope lands, described as, quote, the best conquered lands by far, unquote, that Philip had died for, went for only around 16 cents per acre to 4 extremely shrewd businessmen, some whose family participated in the Great Swamp Massacre. October the 28th of 1681, Mount Hope was incorporated as Town of Bristol, meaning bright place, with Captain Benjamin Church as one of its founding fathers and founder of the Congregational Church. 1690, sugar becomes a cash crop in Jamaica, creating demands for more slaves that enterprising New England merchants are only too glad to meet. Profits from slave trade accelerated dramatically until interrupted by the Revolution. 1696, the Mayflower, the first of many slave ships, enters the waters of Narragansett Bay to unload human cargo into a life of bondage in the land of the free and the home of the brave, which would be transformed instead to the land of the free and the home of the slave. By the time King Philip's head came down from that pole, there were already more than 1,680 slaves working the Indian lands that he and our other great leaders had been killed for. In 1709, the slave market was established on Wall Street near Ground Zero. 1710, the last will and testament of John Whedon of Jamestown, Rhode Island, lists the Indian boy, Toby, for £6 between the carpenter's tools, the hogs, and the sheep. Toby was my ancestor. January 17th of 1717, Colonel Benjamin Church, who helped to kill and enslave so many Wampanoag Indians, died on their lands, leaving an estate of around $1,792, including 2 black slaves and their belongings worth around $239, and 1 Indian servant boy worth around $24. 1750, 4,075 black slaves were in Massachusetts Bay Company by then. 1774, at the dawn of the Euro-American War of Independence, the territories of the second largest and most powerful tribes had become the second largest slaveholding areas in southern New England, as the Liberty Bell is rung 2 years later when Dorcas Honorable was born in Nantucket. At this time, 500,000 black slaves were owned by 2,600,000 white colonists. God forgive America. As the preceding timeline has demonstrated, when our people declared their independence, it was not celebrated in song and story, but met with a fixed determination to teach us we had no such right. The end result was all of our warriors, not slaughtered, were sold into slavery in Bermuda, the West Indies, and points beyond. I've often wondered what became of our patriots torn from our embrace. Were their spirits completely broken? Did their resistance stop? Did they try to escape? What became of their descendants? After meeting one of their descendants at the age of 65, I used my savings to finally visit Bermuda in February of 2002. Their reception for me and demonstrated interest in the tribes they were torn from was completely overwhelming as I looked into the mirror images of the large crowd gathered to welcome me. On this life-transforming experience, spending so much time in the Bermuda archives, I've begun the job of collecting all the information to help in answering all the questions I had and the new questions that have evolved. The long overdue 300-year-old bridge of this reconnection has now been built with the abundance of love and prayers that I continuously thank the Creator for, and I will continue with all of our future generations. Mundu Ego, God is good. Dieo, it is so. We still continue the tradition of communicating with the spirit world as the Creator speaks to us in our dreams and visions, as He did to me Good Friday morning in this very special dream that came as we were planning the Reconnection Festival. It appeared that I was standing with some people on the shoreline, and all in front of me, as far as I could see, was water, but it was dark as midnight. As I continued to look, I could see far off into the distance a group of mostly Indian women, all dressed in bright colors, some with Indian accessories, all holding hands and arranged in the beginning stages of a circle. Starting to slowly dance counterclockwise, they appeared to be standing on the surface of the water. But somehow I knew that directly beneath the surface was a foundation of stone to support them. Arranged in the circle they were forming. Knowing it came our way, we were preparing to reach out and complete this circle as we joined them in this round dance. In their arrangement, if their arrangement had been on the face of a clock, they would have covered the area of around 11:15. And even though the water they were standing on was as dark as night, yet calm, they themselves were as bright as a sunny day. When I awoke, this image was so clear and beautiful in my mind that it certainly, that it seemed very real and filled me with such a good feeling that I felt it was wonderful, a wonderful gift to move to more understanding of what this all symbolized, as it will be revealed to me as the time comes. But the part of the circle where the people stood so far off represented Bermuda. As we were looking south, and the stone foundation to support the circle we were forming indicates the strong support and blessings of the Creator, providing what we need. The foundation, not visible initially, with the revelation that it existed just beneath the surface, serves as a reminder to always look beneath the surface first encountered. The foundation extending in our way demonstrates that even though they cut off our branches, picked off our fruits, they never severed our roots. As someone confirmed to me, the foundation of the circle, counterclockwise, represents my going into the past to find the connection as the movement of the larger circle begins. The fact that the circle in motion indicates that we will continue this movement as we complete the circle. Having mostly women in the circle is a reminder that it is the women who are the strength of a society and set its standards. Our combined movement in the round dance represents the Creator as central to this entire process, and the importance of our ceremonies and the traditions as a source of our strength. Mundu Ego, God is good. Dieo, it is so.
Thank you, Talo, for those words. Next, we will move to Dan Smith, who has been a senior minister at First Church in Cambridge, Congregational United Church of Christ since 2008. And he's become a leader in his congregation in recent efforts to become an anti-racist church. In a 2018 grant-funded sabbatical, Dan explored the themes of remembrance and reparations at First Church, looking into both his own family's and the church's slaveholding past. He has co-led several pilgrimages to Memphis, Selma, Montgomery, and Birmingham, as well as walking tours of Harvard Square to explore sites connected to the 17th and 18th century enslaved and slaveholding members of First Church. And he remains active in the congregation's ongoing efforts towards truth-telling and repair. In 2019, Dan was invited by Harvard President Larry Bacow to serve on a committee of faculty from across the university to guide the multi-year presidential initiative on Harvard and the legacy of slavery. And Dan, you're on mute. You can go ahead and start.
Thank you for this invitation, and thank you so much to Margaret and to Talo Guiden for sharing those powerful remarks. So before sharing about our work with the presidential initiative, I'd like to begin with a bit of background on my own role at First Church and how I came to be a part of Harvard's recent efforts. I'm first and foremost a local church pastor. I graduated from HDS in 2019, or in 1999, I graduated from HDS. It's been a joy to be in a role that has kept me connected to Harvard post-graduation, especially since First Church and Harvard share such deep historic ties. Some of you may remember Peter Gomes, who's been mentioned on this call already. In addition to taking his preaching class and now to teaching it, I was able to audit Peter's class in the yard on the history of Harvard and its presidents. And I don't recall him making mention of enslaved persons that were connected to those presidents. In the early years of Harvard, presidents, overseers, treasurers, professors, staff all held membership at First Church. And in my own preparation for our 375th anniversary in 2011, 6 months before Harvard's 375th, these connections became all the more clear to me. And I also discovered at that time that the names of many enslaved persons were on our church records. There were 33 Africans and 3 Indigenous persons listed on our membership rolls as having, quote, owned and joined the covenant of First Church. However, almost all were not considered members in full communion. Names of Indigenous were listed in our records as follows under the year that they joined: Joseph English, Indian manservant of William Russell; Titus, an Indian servant of President Wadsworth; Lucy, an Indian servant of Mr. Boardman. I'll come back to 2 of these stories in a moment, but in recent years, and especially on the sabbatical I took in 2018, my congregation and I have been endeavoring to learn all that we can about First Church's slaveholding and colonial past and our ancestors' involvement in the kind of racial terror about which we've heard already. We're in the midst of our own process of reckoning with our complicity in this living legacy, of repenting for it, of building relationships with local communities that have been most harmed by this story, and hopefully participating in some form of public remembrance and repair. And our work has thus far included some initial consultation with 2 local Indigenous persons and others in Cambridge who have been harmed by this history. I'll be glad to share more about our congregation's work if there's time later. But in November 2019, and because of this work and our process to date at First Church, I was honored to be invited by President Bacow to participate on the committee. Our mandate calls for, first, a strong grounding in rigorous research; second, a focus on connections, impact, and contributions that are specific to the Harvard community; and finally, investment in opportunities to convene the broader Harvard community to examine the impact and legacy of slavery in 2019 and beyond. The committee's work is currently focused on 4 primary areas of inquiry, each with respective subcommittees. There's one that is exploring how to integrate this history into the curriculum, hopefully for every Harvard student, including some staff and faculty as well. We hope that everybody learns this history. There's a subcommittee on Antigua and the Caribbean. There's a subcommittee on medical education and experimentation that is a part of Harvard's legacy of slavery. And there's a subcommittee on campus and community engagement. As you can tell just from those general categories, the scope and scale of this history of enslavement at Harvard is vast. And I can share that the enslavement of both African and Indigenous persons at Harvard has been a part of our focus from the start. I was asked to co-chair the campus and committee subcommittee with community subcommittee with Stephen Gray from the Graduate School of Design and Taya Miles, professor of history and a Radcliffe alumni professor. I know Taya was invited to speak with you, and I wish she was able to be here given her extraordinary expertise as a historian of slavery. Other subcommittee members include Nancy Cohn from the Business School, Martha Minow from the Law School, Maya Sen from the Kennedy School, David Williams from the Chan School and African American Studies Department, and William Julius Wilson, University Professor Emeritus. The focus of much of our subcommittee's work to date has been on research and relationships aimed at creating what we hope are opportunities for shared learning. There's been a good amount of talk about what we are going to do, but we are as concerned with how we are doing it. We know that we can't begin to address this history alone without being in conversation with partners from communities that have been most harmed by this legacy. And to this end, we've begun planning to engage a pilot group of representative stakeholders, students and faculty from Black and Indigenous groups and initiatives on campus, for example, but also local community leaders right here in Cambridge and in Massachusetts. And that list, still in formation, includes members of local tribes. We haven't reached out yet, but in fact, we are hoping to invite Talo, who has come highly recommended before this panel was planned, to participate in a pilot of community engagement. Meanwhile, our research has been intentionally centered around the lives and stories of both African and Indigenous enslaved persons, in particular those held captive in and around Harvard Square, including Titus and Lucy. We're currently drafting written and graphic materials and maps that can allow us to begin to present a tiny but we think powerful piece of Harvard's legacy of slavery. There's a network, a chain, if you will, of related narratives with geographic proximity to campus. Those households that Margaret mentioned before, where enslaved persons lived, the land they were held captive on and worked and raised families. In some cases, the land that they were buried on are all within blocks of Harvard Yard. And we are planning to center stories on the lives of Lucy and Titus and other enslaved persons like Tony in Cuba, Robin, Cicely, and Jane, who are connected with Harvard families with better known names like Boardman and Wadsworth, Oliver, Brattle, Vassal, and Royal. The latter four each have estates that line Brattle Street, and their names are listed on street signs and plaques all around Cambridge. We're eager to share these stories with members of the community, engage them in conversations around questions like, what are your initial reactions to this history? Once we've taken some time to present the material in a succinct way, centered again around the stories of the enslaved persons themselves, we want to hear what people's reactions to this history is, and whether this history is relevant to their lives and work in community in the here and now. We want to know what else they would like to know and what else they would like others to know. And what can we do to illuminate connections between past and present, and how they would like to see Harvard address this legacy of slavery. And who else should we be speaking with? So I think the focus on the process is coming long before focus on a product of this work. And we are trying to be especially well attuned to who we are speaking with from the start of our campus and community engagement, at least. We know whatever process or product, whatever conversations and actions those conversations might lead to, that there will be far more work to do. We know this initiative also can't fully address the relationship between Harvard and Indigenous persons in general. We're focused on Harvard and slavery, and the slavery of Indigenous persons is very much a part of that. But we believe this is a topic, that more general relationship between Harvard's and Indigenous persons in history. We believe it's a topic deserving of its own future initiative, something perhaps of the scope and scale of what we're involved in, something that can be dedicated to the importance of this topic that includes scholars who are expert, and far more outreach from the start. So stay tuned on that. The committee has tended to focus more on Black slavery, and yet we're working hard to lift up stories, particularly from the 17th, 18th century, and particularly those right around campus, because we think that by virtue of having people move around, walk around the land, perhaps do a walking tour or a virtual walking tour, there will be almost a transformation of how they see themselves as standing land that was never Harvard's to begin with, land on which enslaved persons have walked, land on which many people at Harvard have walked over for decades, and without an awareness of this profound history. So I'll be happy to answer questions. I don't want to take any more time now because I know we're running out. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And thank all the presenters for your comments. I think this provides a much richer and nuanced history than I ever learned in my education about slavery, and future paths for moving forward, recognizing that Indigenous matters at Harvard may also move into its own separate conversation and space. I want to say just some housekeeping issues. We have officially 5 minutes left, but we actually have 30 minutes more for Q&A. So those of you who need to leave in 5 minutes, please feel free to do so. But I would ask Michael to start with our first questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Patrik. I'm Michael Bruvel. I'm the current president of the Harvard Club of Seattle and class of 2019. There are some great questions in the chat, so I'll be helping to moderate the Q&A. And if you have a question, you can either raise your hand on Zoom or type your question in the chat and we will get to you. So one of the first questions that I wanted to start with, and just as a note, I'll stop the recording so that the Q&A can be kind of off the record and open for anyone to share. But one of the first questions that we saw was something that Dove John had put in the chat. And it's kind of more of a philosophical question. I think the way that she was trying to phrase it was, you know, if as you think of slavery, right, of African American and Indigenous peoples, there's this question of how could it have become so widely accepted, right? What were the conditions at the time that led people to do something that we today think, you know, is so unspeakable and so horrid? So anyone could start with that, especially I think the idea is, you know, what was going on in England at the time or with the English that would make this, you know, acceptable and widespread.
That's a question I've thought quite a bit about. It's an excellent one.